Hello and welcome to episode 2 in our tutorial series. In this episode, we're going to look at this beautiful seascape and show you how to make it even better. It was taken by a photographer named Fricks, and I'm not sure if that's a man or a woman, but I do know that he or she used a Canon 5D Mark III and the famous 24mm tilt shift lens. For something like this, where we see some kind of harsh rocks, some aggressive waves, and maybe a gloomy sky, the direction we should head is to make it even more gloomy and extreme. So the first thing we're going to do, though, is make sure that the horizon line is perfectly level. It's something that we as humans notice as being off, even though you might not be able to put your finger on it. It's something you should definitely check and figure out. So in Lightroom, you can go in here and adjust this little slider to whatever effect you might want. But for an image like this, where we've got a very clearly defined horizon, I actually prefer to use the straighten tool. You simply go over here to the top of the horizon, drag it across to the top of the other side, and it'll automatically level it perfectly for you. So with that out of the way, I do want to mention something that didn't come up in the last tutorial, and that is this camera calibration tab. Adobe will often choose to implement its standard profile when you import an image, but I actually don't care for the Adobe standard. For most of my pictures, in fact, almost all of them, I choose camera standard, which is what I was using when I was taking the picture. And again, I don't know what Fricks chose to use, but for this tutorial, I'm going to do my workflow the way I like to do my workflow. So changing that does change the look of saturation and tones, but we are going to continue to work that towards what we want it to look like. So the highlights are really high. I mean, we've got this warning up here letting us know that there is some movement over here that probably needs to be pulled back to the left. So the whites column here is actually what affects that topmost edge of the histogram. Pulling that back is going to flatten the image out in terms of contrast, but we can adjust that later. In fact, I'm even going to pull back the highlights to the same level just to really flatten out this image. What I might also do, and this is a matter of personal taste, would be to bring up the shadows and the black. So we are really compacting this image to the middle of the histogram. However, we can go in here with the contrast and raise that and give it that pop back that we maybe didn't have before. But what's really going to make this image pop is this clarity slider. And this is something that you, on a human being or on a portrait or something animate, we might say, you want to be very careful with. But on a scenic image like this, you can really go crazy. Like, let's just pull this up maybe to there. It just gives it a really clear, defined look. And we might even go in here with the vibrance and raise that up, maybe half what we had the clarity to. Now, what that does, vibrance is like saturation, but it's different. Saturation grabs every color and pulls it up to be more vivid. What vibrance does is it grabs the less saturated tones and it brings them up while leaving the top saturation tones alone. So it kind of equalizes your overall saturation. In fact, speaking of saturation, this hue, saturation, and luminance tab is one that I really like to use. I'm not a big fan of the redness of these rocks here, or the yellowness maybe. I find it to be distracting and I would like to pull it back. So I think it's actually the orange I'm finding to be kind of a challenge. So let's grab the orange tab and we'll just roll this back and kind of mute that section out to make it look a little bit more like what I would prefer it to look like. Again, I don't know what this actual beach looks like, but I'm using this to make art, so I can do anything I want. I'm also really attracted by the aqua color of the waves out there, and so we are going to play those up to a similar level that we pulled down the oranges. And that's just going to make it have, a different mood. One thing for an image like this, where you've got these rocks that could look really good with some extra contrast and detail, is to go in here and increase the sharpness. So as a general rule, I always go about 50% on the amount for any given image. And then for something like this that has a lot of fine detail, I will increase the radius and maybe bring up the detail. Let's just go with 50. It's not so important what you do with these necessarily. What is really important is this masking feature. So what it's going to do is say, I only want to find the edges and adjust the 3 things we just did only to the edges. And in Lightroom, there's a really cool feature that allows you to see what that might look like. So if you hold down the Alt key while grabbing this mask, right now it's saying that everything in the picture is receiving that sharpening. But as I pull it up, it starts saying, okay, the sky doesn't require that amount of sharpening. There are no real edges. The ocean really doesn't require that much sharpening because apart from the waves, it's really not that bad. But as we get up here, we start to see that the rocks do need that level of sharpness. The sky is no longer receiving the sharpening, and most of the ocean isn't as well. So I'd say this is probably a good place to let go. And just like that, the picture ends up being much more sharp without adding noise to those smoother surfaces that don't really make sense to have it. Again, this is a personal preference thing, but I like having a gentle vignette on images like this. So we'll pull this down, maybe -20. And again, I always like increasing the feather to make it look a little bit more natural. And with that, I think the general overall adjustments look really good. What I might do though is bring down the exposure here in the sky. And for that, we'll use this graduated filter. And what you can do is hold down the shift key and just pull and drag. Holding the shift key keeps it perfectly vertical, or in this case, horizontal. And if you let go, we realize that its default was to add some exposure, and that's not what we want. We actually want some negative exposure to really kind of add to the gloom. And then the clarity slider is also kind of helpful to make it look even more dramatic than it might have been before. So with that, I'd say this image is pretty much done. Again, you could go in and fiddle with little bits and pieces here and there, but for an overall look, I think this has been really successful. Last tutorial, I said if you hold down the backspace key, you can see the before and after. I actually meant to say the backslash key right below. So this is what the image looked like before we messed with it, and this is what the image looks like now. So again, hopefully you like what you saw. Please leave us some critique or feedback either below or on our Facebook page, and we look forward to sharing another video with you next week.